The raid began like a streak of light cutting through the thick fog of the panic-stricken days. When the police convoy turned down the narrow path to the abandoned house at the edge of the lake, where mildewed tarps and rusted wire lay still over the cruel secrets Allison had tried to bury. No longer rumors or faint footprints on damp ground. Everything hardened into reality as the bullhorn ordered the occupant to drop any weapons. As boot falls rolled outward into a tightening cordon. As clipped commands sliced through the air like knives severing the rope that had kept Fairmont Crest heavy as a curse for weeks. Chelsea was pulled from air dense with mold and iron, her reddened eyes widening toward a tunnel of light, her hands shaking with exhaustion yet clasping the medic's fingers as if they were the only line tethering her to ordinary life. At the same moment Allison, drunk on the warped power of her own ritual, slipped from a rickety wooden chair when the bright chime of handcuffs touched her wrists, and the old arrogance shattered into splinters amid a helpless scream. For those left behind at Fairmont Crest, for everyone who had lived hour by hour in dread, the moment felt both like a long exhale and like a surreal dislocation, as if watching their own lives through a pane of glass where each detail cut sharp enough to draw blood. But as the ambulance doors shut and the green-red lights withdrew across the dew-wet lawn, everyone understood this salvage was only an opening act for a longer, knottier journey, where the name Allison would cease to be a sudden shadow in a rearview mirror and become a full-dressed case, forcing all to face questions about fairness, truth, and the price of mercy. Chelsea went straight to the hospital, her body bearing the erosion of days worn down to the nub. But what stilled the relatives? Gathered around the bed was the emptiness in her stare, as if her mind had just escaped a windowless room and now blinked against the noon sun. Doctors recited familiar words about trauma and treatment plans and victim support protocols, while a counselor quietly set a small notebook in her hand, advising her to record the spikes of panic to fill in memory's holes, to touch the first flicker of control after control had been stripped away. Anita sat in a corner, fingers interlaced, fear and fury twisting together like a rope cinched at the throat. Vernon stood near the window, watching the parking lot where familiar SUVs arrived and departed, as if the movement might somehow reorder a landscape sliding out of grasp. Danny folded into the chair beside the bed, eyes both splintered and steely, blaming each breath for not seeing sooner, for failing to stop the strange obsession Allison had treated like a misshapen rite. Bill came last, the outdoor chill still on his coat, his silence the kind of wordless helplessness that arrives when the child you once carried across a threshold lies between tubes and monitors, and Naomi balanced on her toes behind her mother, trembling with the knowledge that the border between safety and peril was thin enough to crack under a deep breath. The emotional vortex in that room blew outward the moment the neighborhood group chat began to ping, when questions about the search warrant, the security footage, the unfamiliar van seen 2 weeks prior at the side gate surged all at once and turned Fairmont Crest into a boiling vat of suspicion and self-protection. Security committees met in a rush, gates layered on new ID checks, guest logs were combed line by line, and parents reminded their kids not to walk alone even on the path from the field to the porch. The tranquility that had been sold alongside manicured lawns and bright guard booths peeled back like paint, and when it flaked, everyone saw the long cracks running through a community they had believed unshakable. On the legal front, Allison was booked that very night to await arraignment, the charge sheet so long the clerk needed a fresh page. Kidnapping, unlawful confinement, intentional injury, threats, coercion, a string of aggravators tied to planning and duration. The first court-appointed attorney appeared as a formality, then was swiftly replaced by a colder face with the kind of network that seemed to recognize a few powerful silhouettes in the neighboring districts, enough to spark the fear that the game was sliding toward hush deals and subterranean clauses. The bail hearing tested every side. The prosecution laid out the risk of flight, the danger of her conduct, irregularities in Allison's finances in the days before the bust. The defense sheltered behind a shield of instability, hinting at an unverified mental health history, petitioning for competency and criminal responsibility evaluations, trying to pull the fight from the hard ground of cameras and logs into the fog of medical terminology. The judge, careful yet unwilling to appear soft beneath public pressure, listened, ordered an independent assessment, and imposed confinement in a specialty facility under maximum supervision with no contact beyond counsel. The ruling split the community. Some exhaled because Allison would not stroll down their sidewalks at once. Others fretted that the path from treatment ward to courtroom is paved with procedural gaps where a fuzzy report can morph into a key. Meanwhile, Chelsea faced a set of cruel choices with no option free of a scrape. Could she muster the courage to return to the familiar house where every corner was stapled to laughter from easier days? Or must she leave Fairmont Crest to reclaim sleep that would not be shredded at midnight by the rattle of a window against its frame? Counselors urged the rebuild of safety habits. Move with loved ones, avoid routes that trigger flashbacks, confront fear through incremental therapy, track each sudden spike so she could learn to recognize and defuse it. After a sleepless night, Danny proposed sheltering the girl with relatives on the outskirts, beneath a darker canopy of trees distinct enough that the mind wouldn't blur present with past. Bill objected that running from memory turns memory into the hunter. Naomi, her usual bright voice reduced to a murmur, said she only wanted her sister safe, and Haley, who had kept deliberate distance through old fractures, stepped forward and set a hand on Danny's shoulder, a wordless promise of solidarity in adversity. Beyond the family, Martin and Kat, who had combed the footpaths around the lake, brought back a shard that chilled everyone. A blurry video from an aging dockside camera showing a stranger the night before the raid, waiting at the back door for several minutes before vanishing, as if confirming something and letting go. Joey cracked a burner phone tossed behind a sink, finding a string of crude coded messages that spoke of a last time and confirmed sidegate. Phrases suggestive of someone not in the room with Allison but keeping the plan's pulse. Vanessa traced scattered phone top-ups to a convenience store 15 minutes from the neighborhood, where the in-store camera happened to glitch during suspect windows. Together, the fragments lengthened the question list. Had Allison truly been alone, or had a hand always hung behind the curtain? If so, why hadn't that person intervened at the end? Was the goal solely to detain Chelsea, or to test the community's manipulability, to survey law enforcement's response times and choke points as rehearsal for something bolder? The prosecution, sensing a second fuse smoldering, moved for an expanded investigation order, while Allison's team launched a surface calming strategy. Paint her as someone who slipped off the rails after personal upheavals, frame devotion swelled by delusion, push for mandatory treatment over simple punishment, and quietly hint at helpful information for other case files in exchange for leniency. The phrase "could be helpful" pricked the ears of anyone fluent in power games. What secret did Allison hold that might buy years of freedom? A secret about a figure of influence near Fairmont Crest? About murky cash flows in a development project? About unseen strands linking families that insist they never intersect? Anita, who had built a life on rules, wavered at the thought of justice bartered like merchandise, while Vernon tapped a knuckle on the sill, aware the match had drifted far from black and white lines. In the meantime, Eva, sharpened by what she'd lately witnessed from the adults, became hypersensitive to signs of horse trading, and that sensitivity placed her by chance within earshot of two men arguing in the hospital's basement garage, where a name was swallowed by a car door slam but clear enough to lodge in memory. When she wrote the name on paper for Naomi, both stared. Craig. Not a stranger. Bits of talk had floated around him before, and now the syllables flared like a spark in the dim picture. At the next hearing, Allison's counsel filed for a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation with snippets of earlier, sporadic treatment notes, and the prosecution countered with audio recorded inside the hideout, Allison's voice distinctly laying out a calculated ritual of coercion. The judge flipped through the pages, approved the evaluation with strict supervision and tight deadlines, and warned that delay tactics would be construed as procedural abuse. Beneath the formalities, tension seeped into every corner of Fairmont Crest. Family dinners became quick huddles, hugs lasted longer than usual, eyes slid away when the question of staying or leaving the neighborhood surfaced. In a moment of calm, Chelsea decided to try the backyard at dusk, where thin sunlight spread across the grass. The first step thudded in her chest, the second fell lighter, and on the third she heard Naomi calling from the porch, not to pull her back, but to ease her forward with the assurance that new boundaries could be staked on the very ground where old ones were toppled. Treatment began. Sessions taught Chelsea to name the panic that rose at a metallic clang, to breathe through the waves, to remember that memory is not a life sentence. On another floor, Martin and Kat compiled every timestamp where the name Craig brushed the comms web. Joey followed transactions tied to a short-term rental across the lake, and Vanessa dug through legacy work orders for the side gate where an access gap had never been fully corrected. Each small shard, though not yet a picture, suggested Allison had a fulcrum, and it was not an hallucination. When the prosecution signaled intent to add conspiracy counts upon proof of an accomplice, the courtroom air thickened. And in the same breath, the defense pivoted, implying that if the state pushed too far, Allison would selectively reveal sensitive materials she had accidentally come across, documents that might render a few people disinclined to see her tried in open court. That was no longer a plea. It was a slate-gray threat, and it tightened collars all over Fairmont Crest. At this fork, the community had to choose. Demand maximum punishment even if dirty waves would smash ashore as secrets were flung into the floodlights, or accept a long road of compelled treatment in exchange for surface calm while leaving a thorn embedded. Anita wanted even-handed justice. Danny needed her daughter whole before anything else. Bill understood that however cruel, truth is the only foundation that doesn't collapse. And Naomi thought about the other kids on the block, whether their fear would ever fade if the shadow named Allison wasn't cut down to the root. The question of a lengthy sentence or escape through the psychiatric corridor thus became not only a matter of law, but a test of the neighborhood's moral backbone. Just as people thought they had picked a side, a small event tilted the scales. A USB drive left in Kat's mailbox, carrying a copy of a dockside conversation on a rainy night 3 weeks earlier, 2 voices, one Allison's, the other a man with a timbre matching Craig's, discussing the side gate guard's shift change and returning the rental before sunrise. The clip wasn't long enough to nail a verdict, but it blew apart any illusion that Allison had been an isolated shadow. The revelation turned the next hearing into a taut wire. Prosecutors sought an emergency warrant for the man named Craig. Allison's counsel argued the evidence was inadmissible due to unclear provenance, and the judge weighed procedural integrity against a palpable risk to the community. In the screech of metal-on-metal tension, Chelsea sat behind frosted glass, watching silhouettes move like chess pieces, recognizing that her story had moved beyond the private self into the deeper layer of what a place called home must protect. Would Allison serve many years, the promise of justice people needed to cling to, or would she slip through a system both delicate and labyrinthine, leaning on a diagnosis written in slick terminology, on a secret bargain, on a hand that still knocks 3 times on back doors with dark porches? Was the accomplice truly just a man named Craig, or did Craig anchor a chain of links, each believing itself safe beneath the code of a title or a relationship? At Fairmont Crest, where leaves remained green and lawns evenly cut, nights no longer sounded the same, because everyone knew what had surfaced was only the tip of ice while nameless things chilled the water day by day. Yet in the cold, Chelsea set the small notebook on her lap and wrote in lines that no longer trembled. That she would testify when the time came, that she would stay and rebuild boundaries on this exact ground, that she did not want the neighborhood's children to grow up learning that evil can come home every night if it is clever. The calm strokes planted a new tone in the air, one of patience and endurance. Perhaps that is the only force keeping the scale from tipping fully toward darkness. Whether or not Allison is sentenced to years, whether or not a hidden power tries to interfere, whether or not a man named Craig is cuffed or still loiters in the shade. Because when a victim claims the right to define her life, manipulation slowly loses the soil it needs to root. In the coming days, court will reconvene, lawyers will argue, evidence will be augmented, assessments will be cross-examined. Surprises will arrive, face-down cards will flip, and scheming will rustle behind curtains. But there will also be vows written in indelible ink by a community that refuses to let a story born of fear end in silence. And it is that persistence, at last, that stands as the only fulcrum strong enough to keep Fairmont Crest upright when another wind rises from a horizon not yet seen.